All right. So, hey, my name is Nate, and I am here with the author of The Night Riders of Hardin County by Lance Hansmann. And we just wanted to go over a little bit about the book and kind of some interesting stuff about it. So, Lance, I've known you for a long time. Full
Quite a
disclosure,
few years, yeah.
yeah, quite a few years. He's my cousin, and it's funny because I've been to where this book is been for all my life.
Yeah.
And I just want to know kind of how you found out about the story because, I never heard it. And, my dad was lived there. So anyway, go ahead, Lance, take it away.
Yeah. I mean, look, growing up as a kid, Steamboat Rock, Iowa, a small village, in north central Iowa, 300 people
Yeah.
for the last better part of a century. That's been the population. It's not
Yeah.
gone up, it's not gone down. It's just what it is, right? And so you hear legends of things that happened, when the town began in the mid 1800s. And there was one story about the family of the Rainsbargers, five brothers. There were five girls, five boys,
Hmm.
immigrants from Ohio. But the boys were from the wrong side of the tracks,
Right.
and so it started, I think, when I was a little kid, elementary school. We heard about if you do something bad in school, the Rainsbargers will get you, or something like that. And so
Wow.
it kind of started there. And then as you get older, you hear a little bit more specifics about, well, there were five brothers and they used to rob people, steal horses, steal cattle. Some said they were tied to the Jesse James gang, from the late 1800s. And you kind of hear that, and personally, I dismissed it. It's just like, oh, nice. That's fun. I didn't think anything of it. And then you realize part of it was apparently true, but then I don't know, it just wasn't talked about a great deal.
Hmm.
Until about 20 years ago, I suppose. My Aunt Carol um,
Yeah.
came to me. I was on visit from California, where I lived at the time, and she said, "Remember the story about the Rainsbargers?" I said, "Well, not really a story. I remember the family." And she said, "They may not be guilty of doing anything." And so she had apparently talked to somebody, and I said, "Okay." Fast forward to about 13 years ago. And I started talking to some people more seriously about it. Some of the descendants of the Rainsbargers still lived
Hmm.
in Steamboat Rock,
Hmm. Oh, that's
and they
amazing.
said, "Yeah, we think they were wrongly accused." And then fast forward to I moved back to Iowa in 2015
Hmm.
and got connected with the great granddaughter of Martha Rainsbarger, who, as it turns out, her name is Mildred Griffin. She turned 100 last year.
Oh, geez.
And she is the mother of my first high school basketball coach. Um,
Really?
but I didn't know her per se when I was
Right.
in high school. So we got connected. She's the great granddaughter of Martha Rainsbarger. She gave me a bunch of historical documentation, family history. We started to talk about it. And when I started to hear her talk about with such passion how her family was wronged,
Hmm.
I got interested. And
Yeah.
she said, "I heard you're a writer and I'd love for you to write this story." Um,
Wow.
and I
That's
said,
amazing.
yeah, yeah, it was kind of a neat thing. But even then I said, "Mildred, I will only write the story if I can, if you're saying your family's innocent, and I get that. And I appreciate that. And who wouldn't do that? Right."
Right.
I said, "But I'm only going to write the book if I figure out who did." I said, "So if I find out your family did it or partially did it, are you okay with that?" And she said, "I want the truth out there." And so for the past 13 years, on and off, I've had full-time work, but, on the
Right.
side, I research at night. And I went through, oh man, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of newspaper articles from the mid 1800s to the mid 1900s, um, trying to figure out what was reported on, who said what. The trial, a large part of the trial transcript was printed back then in the
Right.
newspaper. she had some affidavits from people because there are two of the brothers were killed, and two were sent to prison for 30 years. And so this story really is about telling that story and finding out, did they do it? Did they not? If not, who did it? And once I figured it out, it was kind of one of those, moments where I'm like, did I just really figure this out? And once I did, I had to write it. And that's when the book got finished officially.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's so intriguing, from I, I don't know, but it's and the part that I think, and I just want to kind of I talked to my dad about this,
Mm,
Uncle Gordon to you.
yep.
um and the thing is that the information that you got about how the plot and the story was pushed in Eldora and in Steamboat Rock, Iowa, and how there was a completely different bent on it,
Hmm.
and like the story was completely different in Marshalltown.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because we just went through something where stories got suppressed.
Right.
And
Yeah.
I immediately started thinking about that when I was reading your book, and I'm like, this is an old story, but it sure has a very
Yeah.
relevant, like today, like you put something out on social media and they were trying to, basically it was cancel culture before
Yeah.
cancel culture was a thing.
Yep.
And I mean, did you kind of get that when you were kind of writing that, or?
Yeah, I mean, you kind of hit it on the head because the thing I noticed as I started researching and especially reading the old newspaper articles, this the parallels that I saw with what's happening today. I mean, it was
Crazy.
like literally I could turn on CNN or Fox News today, and I could go back and look at the story that I was writing based on largely the newspaper articles that were written back then, and it was no different. And the thing that I learned is that even as far back as then, the media has an agenda and the media can be bought, and especially at the inception of this village, Steamboat Rock, mid 1800s. Its name was Lithopolis, and then it became Steamboat Rock because of
I
a
didn't know that.
carving in the cliffs that were
Right.
along the river, and all of these things and how they began. They were started by wealthy men. All towns were, back then in any state. And
Right.
so the men who are wealthy wanted things their way. That's no different than today.
Right.
Um, and they use their power, their wealth, and their influence to to craft a narrative that they want people to buy into that casts them in a favorable and usually profitable light. So as I was reading all these newspaper articles and I was thinking about the fact that the newspaper man at the time had been bought,
Mm-hmm.
tricked, to be fair, tricked, but also bought.
Was
Um, it just it didn't it both surprised me, and then didn't because of what we see today, and the news stopped being, or if it's ever been unbiased, it's long since stopped being unbiased. And I don't care whether you're watching MSNBC or CNN or you're watching Fox News, they both have a bias.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to live with that and deal with that today. And back then, when you separate the inhabitants of Hardin County by a mile at minimum, the distance between farms, usually farther than that, people go to town once a week, once a month.
Right.
They get their news from word of mouth. And if someone that they believe they trust says a thing, they believe that. And if that person got their news from someone they thought, and so it kind of goes down this very interesting, telephone game, of
Right.
news and how it travels. And it was so easy to influence back then. One guy could go in and purchase 500 newspapers, distribute them as they see fit, as long as the newspaper man was writing what he said he wanted written. And I saw also a lot of parallels to there's an old HBO show series called Deadwood, that
Hmm.
was written about the inception of that town in South Dakota in the late 1800s.
Okay, I
And
heard of it.
similar, similar how the news was printed and who could get what said and where and how it was all very, very, very similar, so wealthy men ruled the world.
I know, and they wanted to pin it on the Rainsbargers. I mean, it turned into a telephone game that was generational, so that when you were in grade school, Rainsbarger was like a that four-letter word.
Yeah, and that's the unfortunate thing. And I talked to Uncle Gordon, about this as well. And he
Yeah,
asked a really, really good question right before I was done with the book. Because I'd learned a lot, researched a lot, didn't have the ending that I wanted yet. Didn't find out exactly who was in charge. I had suspicions, but he asked a really good question. He grew up in Steamboat Rock, graduated from high school there, as did my mother, his sister, and so did I. So did his dad, my grandfather.
yeah.
So I'm sixth generation from Steamboat Rock, and he made a really good comment. He said the town that I grew up in, and the town that you grew up in, meaning me, he said was a God-fearing, good community of people who, by and large, went to church and or at least respected that.
Oh yeah,
What happened? Because the lawlessness that I was writing about in the book, based on fact, really is not in place there today and wasn't when I grew up there and wasn't when he grew up. He said, "What do you think happened?" And as I got near the end of the book, it became really clear to me that good people, unlike bad people, speaking generally, good people feel guilt. And I think that there were a lot of good people back then who were tricked into doing bad things for the sake of protecting, under the guise of protecting their own families. And when they realized after what they had done, guilt set in, and it's a lot easier for Dutch and German populations like lived in Steamboat Rock and
yeah,
English, to just not talk about it. And let's
right.
just leave that alone, push it under the rug, and we'll just let it go. And that's just the way it is, And so there were good people that did some bad things that regretted it, and I believe, in a way, repented.
Yeah,
Um, and yeah, Steamboat Rock is today, it's a beautiful, picturesque little community. Um, but it didn't start that way.
yeah. I know. It personally to me, like, like, I don't know, the scene of, and I didn't even know this, and the thing that you researched about the passenger train that went into Steamboat Rock.
Hmm.
And I know where that is. And I'm
Yeah.
sitting there and I'm like, because that bend and that turn,
Hmm.
that you're talking about, I'm like, that was a passenger train that went through there. That's
Yeah.
wild.
Yeah.
Like it's like something that I never knew. I just, to me, it was more vivid, than probably a lot of people that aren't from that area. But I think a lot of people that are from the area, I really think they should read this book because
Yeah.
it has all the things that that how do you get good people to do bad things? I mean, why did Hitler let you know
Yeah.
push people to do bad things? Well, because he was the man, and so
Yeah.
was the guy that was the puppeteer behind there,
Mhm.
had those same traits
Yeah.
to push something out, to the public and to twist it, using power, I
Yeah.
guess, power and authority, right?
Yeah.
To make their will, be the truth and the
Yeah.
facts, and because the facts don't matter.
Yeah, I mean, there was
I
at
guess.
the first book signing we had back in Steamboat Rock, one guy asked a really good question, and he said, "Why do you think they did it?" And it was a perfect question from the perfect guy because I was able to say, "Do you have a daughter?" knowing that he does. And he said, "Yeah." And I said, "What wouldn't you do to protect her?"
Hmm.
And he didn't have to answer. because I knew the answer, right? And he knew the answer. There's
Right.
nothing that any father would not do to protect his child. And back then, when news traveled slowly, and people lived farther apart, and there was a lot of dark space between where you lived. You know, even in town, it's not lit up like even today, Steamboat Rock is not lit up
No.
like a city. It's a small village, right?
Yeah.
So there's that element of, I would argue, this underlying element of fear. Um, who could be lurking? And if you don't, and maybe nobody is if you don't think about it. We grew up in an idyllic era in the 70s and 80s.
Right.
There was nothing bad that happened. If it did, it was on television. It wasn't where we lived. But imagine then hearing from somebody that you knew or trusted that there was something bad out there and be careful. When you're suddenly all alone on a farm like that, especially back then, there's no telephone, there's none of that.
Right.
And you think that something bad might be hiding in the dark. That's a different way to live. And
True.
everybody started to feel that because it was printed in the newspaper that there were 5 men at minimum out there, plus their gang, who were raping, pillaging, counterfeiting, stealing without remorse.
Mm.
And watch out. So, they formed a society, a vigilant society to protect themselves because the law at the time was a sheriff and a couple of deputies. And that's not enough to protect 500 to 800 people living in the country and a surrounding community. People had to protect themselves.
Right.
Um, so fear does a lot of bad things to people. Now, when it turns out the fear is unwarranted and it's all been made up to divert attention away from people who are actually doing wrong, then that has a whole other element, right, to what's going on. So,
Yeah. And that's the key right there, is to that's my key takeaway. I mean, first of all, it's a very great plot, it's a great book, but to me, it's like it is vital and important, to read something like this because it makes you think, you know, that is what this person's saying really true? Or
right,
do they have their own personal agenda behind what they're saying?
right.
Do I know, like, and trust them, and can I verify this information that I'm being told?
Yeah,
Because that's very pertinent to, like, like whether we should go to war with said country,
yeah,
or or should we all sit in a little house and not go out anywhere,
right.
for a pandemic, versus actually, like, looking at an alternate, source of things. And that to me is just that really, along with the fact that these people were so controlling, they so controlled that,
Yeah,
that narrative,
yep,
and it's such a fascinating thing. And I certainly hope, one day, Lance, that this is my hope is that this is a movie, because honestly, that'd be fantastic to put Steamboat Rock, Iowa, on a
yeah.
movie
It
map,
would be,
man.
it would be fun. I mean,
my
it would
little
be,
my little our little town. I don't know. I
yeah,
call it. I feel like I'm not from there, but, like, I don't know. I've been there so many times, and I feel like it's my home, even though it's really not my
yeah.
home. But
Yeah, I mean, I think it'd be great. The thing that about this story that really, really struck me was, and the way that I wanted to write it is, it's one thing to say that things happened, and that's fine. I grew up hearing that things happened. I grew up hearing the Rainspargers were bad with no real explanation. Um, that's typical, right? It's not weird. It's the way it is. But for me, I like to figure out how things work, whether it's computer software, whether it's a piece of writing, I get very lost sometimes in the details and the minutia because I like to figure and tinker and understand things. And so for me, it was important to write this story as sort of a how-to, because in a sense, I wanted to unravel not just what happened and who was behind it, but how'd they do it? How in the
right,
world did they pull this off? And so as you read through this story, if you read for understanding, you'll see exactly how they went about it and how simple it really was. Simple in the sense, if you have the money,
yeah,
you can accomplish anything. And that's what happened. You know, certain people had the money and they had something they wanted to accomplish, and they just simply paid for it. And they got a few people without any moral compass to execute what they wanted. And so as you read through each chapter, you get to see not just what happened and who was behind it, but how they accomplished it and how it turned an entire county upside down. And you made a comment at the beginning of this that people in Marshall County thought differently. So influence ran in circles back then.
Mhm.
And so Marshall County had different leadership. Hardin County had different leadership, and Grundy County was a little different. They all had different newspapers. They all were beholding to somebody different, not all the same person. And so when all these things were happening in Hardin County, Marshall County and that paper was reporting something a little different. And sometimes in criticism of what was happening in Hardin County, almost making fun of the backwards way things were being reported, you know.
Right,
So there was that element also. So Hardin County kind of put themselves on this island um, of
right.
sin, so to speak. And it was, yeah, interesting to kind of unravel all that and tell it.
But people in Hardin County would never know anything about that
They
because
wouldn't.
it's not,
No.
it's not, it is not, there ain't no internet.
Yeah, exactly
Things go
right.
around the world and twice in our day
Yep.
now before we even like, wait, what the heck just happened?
Yep.
You know,
Yep.
you hear about it twice. It's like, oh man,
Yeah. Well, and you think back, it wasn't that long ago, 70s and
no, it
80s,
wasn't.
where our way of getting the news was twofold, you know, well, three technically: radio, television, and newspaper. And newspapers came out twice a week. Um, you know, in high school, I didn't listen to the radio much except for music. I'd turn off the news. So that's not where I listened to the news. I didn't like watching it on TV in high school. I'd read the newspaper because people I knew played sports. So when, you know, I got to read about that. But even, you know, in my era as a child growing up, news traveled much more slowly.
Oh yeah,
So
I read the newspaper because I used to deliver them.
yeah, there you go. Yep.
So,
Yep.
well, wow, this is awesome. I appreciate your time, Lance. Thanks
Yep.
for coming on the call. And I just wanted to encourage everybody here to, I have a link down below that you can either do it on the Audible if you want to listen to it, or if you want to purchase the book, there's a link down below. Just hit that link, and I think you'll be very pleased with what you read or hear.
Appreciate it.